There is a secret buried in clay, a truth so explosive it could rewrite everything we know about human origins, not hidden in the shadows of some government laboratory or locked away in classified files, but sitting in plain sight in the world's museums, universities and archaeological archives. Thousands of clay tablets covered in the wedge-shaped script of the world's first civilization, telling a story that mainstream science desperately wants to dismiss as mythology. But what if it isn't myth? What if these ancient texts are literal historical records documenting the single most important event in human history? The moment when an advanced extraterrestrial race descended to Earth and genetically engineered our species into existence. This is the story the Sumerian tablets tell. This is the secret of the Anunnaki. Before we dive deeper into this ancient mystery, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. Picture yourself standing in the British Museum in London. The year is 1872. You're surrounded by scholars, religious leaders, politicians, their eyes fixed on a man holding a fragment of baked clay. His name is George Smith, a self-taught genius who started his career as a banknote engraver, but taught himself to read the strange wedge-shaped symbols pressed into ancient Mesopotamian tablets. What he's about to announce will send shockwaves through Victorian society. The fragment he holds contains a flood story. Not just any flood story, but one that predates the biblical account of Noah by 1,000 years. A story of a man warned by the gods to build a great boat to survive a deluge that would destroy all of humanity. The story includes the detail of birds sent out to find dry land. It describes the boat coming to rest on a mountain peak. Every element that Christians and Jews had believed to be unique, divine revelation, here it was, written in clay long before the Hebrew Bible was even conceived. The audience erupts in stunned silence that transforms into heated debate. If this ancient Mesopotamian text contained the flood story first, then what did that say about the Bible? Was Genesis a copy of older pagan myths? Smith's discovery was the beginning of a journey that would take us deep into the origins of civilization itself and force us to confront an unsettling possibility, that the gods of the ancient world were not metaphors or projections of the human imagination. They were real physical beings who walked among our ancestors and shaped the course of human evolution. But to understand the full implications of what the Sumerian tablets reveal, we must first journey back to the land where human civilization was born, to the place the ancient texts called Eden, the land between two rivers. Close your eyes and imagine the world as it was 6,000 years ago. The great ice sheets that covered much of Europe and North America have long since melted. Sea levels have risen. The climate has stabilized into the warm interglacial period that would become the cradle of human civilization. And in one very specific location on this planet, something extraordinary is happening. In southern Mesopotamia, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, people are doing something humans have never done before on such a scale. They are building cities. This is Sumer, the world's first civilization. And it appears with such stunning sophistication, such sudden complexity, that scholars have struggled for over a century to explain how it could have developed so quickly. Archaeological evidence shows that around 4000 BCE, small farming villages in this region underwent a transformation so rapid and so complete that it defies the normal patterns of cultural evolution. Within a few hundred years, these simple settlements had become thriving urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands. They had developed the world's first writing system, a complex pictographic script that would evolve into cuneiform. They invented the wheel, not just as a toy or curiosity, but as a practical technology that revolutionised transportation and pottery making. They created sophisticated irrigation systems that turned the harsh Mesopotamian plains into an agricultural paradise capable of supporting massive populations. They developed advanced mathematics based on a sexagesimal or base 60 system that we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. They built massive architectural structures called ziggurats, stepped pyramids that rose hundreds of feet into the air, dominating the landscape like man-made mountains. They established the first organised religion with professional priests, elaborate temples, and a complex pantheon of gods. They created the first legal codes, the first schools, the first literature, the first astronomy, the first medicine. Everything that we associate with civilization appeared here first, fully formed, as if someone had flipped a switch. The sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization is what archaeologists call the urban revolution. But calling it a revolution doesn't explain it. Traditional theories suggest that agriculture led to settled communities, which led to population growth, which led to specialization of labor, which eventually resulted in complex urban societies. But the Sumerian case doesn't fit this gradual model. The transition was too fast, too complete, too sophisticated. It's as if someone handed the Sumerians an instruction manual for building a civilization. And according to the clay tablets the Sumerians themselves left behind, someone did. The tablets speak of the time before cities, when humans lived as primitive nomads. They describe a pivotal moment when the gods decided to civilize humanity, to teach them the arts of agriculture, architecture, writing and governance. The tablets list the first 5 cities established before a great flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak. They provide the names of the kings who ruled these cities, and most remarkably, they describe the gods who founded them, not as distant cosmic forces or abstract principles, but as physical beings who came down from the heavens, who lived among humans, who ate and drank and argued, and made decisions that directly affected human destiny. The Sumerian word for these gods was Anunnaki, and the question that has haunted researchers for decades is simple yet profound. Were the Anunnaki merely religious concepts, anthropomorphic projections of natural forces, the ancient imagination trying to make sense of a complex world? Or were they something else entirely? To answer that question, we must turn to the texts themselves. We must read what the ancient Sumerians actually wrote about their gods, and we must follow the controversial interpretation that transformed our understanding of human origins forever, the work of a man named Zecharia Sitchin. In 1906, a book appeared that would ignite one of the most enduring and controversial theories in the history of alternative archaeology, The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin was not a trained archaeologist or a professional linguist in the academic sense. Born in Russia and raised in Palestine, he studied economics and worked as a journalist and executive. But he had taught himself to read Sumerian cuneiform, and he brought to the ancient texts a radical new interpretive framework. He read them not as myths or religious allegories, but as literal historical documents describing actual events. The thesis of the 12th Planet was breathtaking in its scope and implications. According to Sitchin's interpretation of the Sumerian tablets, our solar system contains a planet that has not been discovered by modern astronomy. He called it Nibiru, and he claimed it has a vast elliptical orbit that brings it through the inner solar system once every 3,600 years. This planet, Sitchin argued, is the homeworld of the Anunnaki, an advanced humanoid race who first arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago. They did not come as benevolent teachers or spiritual guides. They came as miners. They came for gold. Sitchin's translation of the texts led him to conclude that the Anunnaki needed gold to repair the deteriorating atmosphere of their home planet Nibiru. They discovered that Earth's crust contained abundant deposits of the precious metal, particularly in southeastern Africa. So they established a colonial operation. They set up bases in Mesopotamia, which they called Edin, meaning the flatlands. They began the grueling work of extracting gold from deep within the earth. The Anunnaki who came to Earth were not the highest-ranking members of their civilization. They were workers, labourers assigned to a colonial expedition. The tablets describe how they dug canals to channel the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, how they excavated mines, how they toiled for thousands of years under harsh conditions, and eventually, according to the texts Sitchin analysed, they rebelled. The story is preserved in an epic called the Atrahasis, one of the oldest pieces of literature ever discovered, dating to approximately 1600 BCE, but preserving traditions that are far more ancient. The text describes a council of gods convened to address a labour crisis. The lesser gods, called the Agigi, had been assigned the back-breaking work of maintaining the irrigation systems and mining operations. After 40 years of gruelling labour, they burned their tools and surrounded the house of Enlil, the commander of the Earth mission, demanding relief. Enlil, the stern authoritarian leader, wanted to punish the rebels, but another Anunnaki named Enki, the chief scientist and Enlil's half-brother, proposed a different solution. Instead of punishing the workers, Why not create a replacement workforce? A primitive creature that could be engineered to take over the labour while the Anunnaki supervised from a more comfortable position. This is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Because what Enki proposed was not the creation of robots or machines. He proposed the genetic engineering of a new species. He proposed the creation of humanity. The Atrahasis epic describes the process in remarkable detail. Enki calls upon the mother goddess Nintu, also known as Ninhursag or Mami. She is the specialist, the expert in what we might today call bioengineering. The text states that they sacrificed a god named Geshtu-E, described as having intelligence. His flesh and blood were mixed with clay, but this was not ordinary clay. Modern scholars interpret this as a euphemism for organic material, perhaps genetic material. The tablets describe how the Igigi god spat upon the clay mixture. Some researchers interpret this spitting as the contribution of genetic material through saliva, a primitive understanding of DNA transfer. Nintu then divided the mixture into 14 portions. 7 would become males, 7 would become females. The text explicitly states that these proto-humans were gestated in the wombs of Anunnaki goddesses. 14 goddesses served as surrogate mothers. The gestation period is given as 10 months, and at the end of that time, the first humans were born. The text describes Nintu's proclamation after the successful birth. I have removed your heavy work. I have imposed your toil on man. You raised a cry for mankind. I have loosened your yoke. I have established freedom. This is not the language of spiritual metaphor. This is the language of a technical achievement. The tablets describe humanity's creation as a deliberate act of genetic manipulation, combining the essence of the gods, their DNA, with the raw material of a primitive hominid that already existed on Earth. Mainstream scholars who study these texts interpret them very differently. They see them as myths explaining the human condition, religious narratives about why humans must work and toil while the gods rest. They view the creation story as a theological statement about humanity's subservient relationship to the divine, not a literal account of genetic engineering. The academic consensus is clear. The Anunnaki were simply the principal deities of the Sumerian pantheon. Anunnaki means princely offspring, or those of royal blood, referring to their status as the children of An, the sky god. The stories of human creation are mythological, borrowed and adapted by later Hebrew scribes when they wrote the Book of Genesis. The similarities between the Sumerian texts and biblical narratives, like the creation of humanity, from clay and divine essence, are explained as cultural transmission, not as evidence of a hidden historical truth. But Sitchin and those who followed him asked a provocative question. If these are merely myths, why are they so specific? Why do the tablets provide technical details about the creation process, describe multiple generations of failed prototypes before the successful model, specify gestation periods, name the specific gods involved, and outline the precise purpose for which humans were created? The text of the Atrahasis provides details that seem oddly scientific for ancient mythology. It describes how the first humans were not perfect, they required modification. The tablets mention that initially, the humans could not reproduce on their own. Enki and Nintu had to perform additional genetic adjustments to grant humans the ability to procreate naturally. The story of Adapa, often identified as the first fully functional human, tells of a being created by Enki with great wisdom and understanding but deliberately denied immortality. The Hebrew Bible, written thousands of years later, echoes these Sumerian themes in Genesis. Adam is formed from the dust of the earth and given life by divine breath. Eve is created from Adam's genetic material, his rib. They live in a garden called Eden, provided for by their creators. They are forbidden from eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. The serpent, often associated with Enki in ancient iconography, encourages them to disobey and gain knowledge. When they do, they are expelled from Eden, forced to toil and work for their survival. The parallels are unmistakable. The critical question is whether these parallels exist because the Genesis author borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian myths, as mainstream scholars believe, or because both texts are describing the same historical event from different cultural perspectives, as alternative historians suggest. To evaluate this question properly, we must examine what modern science tells us about the actual origins of Homo sapiens. Because if the Anunnaki story is true, if humans were genetically engineered by an advanced extraterrestrial race, then we should find evidence of that intervention in our own biology. We should find something strange, something that doesn't fit the normal pattern of evolutionary development. And according to some researchers, we do. The scientific consensus on human evolution is well established. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago, evolving from earlier hominin species like Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus. The oldest known fossils of anatomically modern humans have been found at sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to about 300,000 years ago, and Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, dated to approximately 195,000 years ago. The transition from archaic hominins to modern humans was gradual, involving a mosaic of changes over hundreds of thousands of years. Our brains expanded, our skulls became more globular, our faces flattened, our bodies became more gracile. These changes occurred through the normal mechanisms of evolution, natural selection, genetic drift, and sexual selection. The genetic evidence strongly supports an African origin. Mitochondrial DNA studies trace all living humans back to a common maternal ancestor who lived in Africa around 150 to 200,000 years ago, popularly called mitochondrial Eve. Y chromosome studies trace paternal lineages back to a similar time frame. Studies of genetic diversity consistently show that African populations have the highest genetic diversity, which is exactly what we'd expect if humanity originated there and then spread outward, going through population bottlenecks as small groups migrated to other continents. The Out of Africa model, which has been repeatedly validated through multiple lines of evidence, proposes that anatomically modern humans expanded out of Africa in waves, with the major expansion occurring around 60 to 70,000 years ago. These humans encountered and interbred to a limited extent with archaic human species like Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia, but ultimately replaced them. This is the established scientific narrative. It's supported by fossils, by genetics, by archaeology, by dating techniques. It's as close to scientific fact as we can get in the study of human origins. But here's where it gets interesting. The timeline of human evolution shows something peculiar. For millions of years, human evolution proceeded at a relatively slow, steady pace. Australopithecines appeared around 4 million years ago, Homo habilis around 2 million years ago, Homo erectus around 2 million years ago, and remained relatively unchanged for over 1 million years. Then suddenly, in the last 300,000 years, human evolution accelerates dramatically. We don't just get anatomically modern humans, we get humans with massively expanded brains, complex language, symbolic thought, art, music, sophisticated tool-making, and an explosion of cognitive abilities that seem to appear almost out of nowhere in evolutionary terms. Some researchers have pointed to what they call the Great Leap Forward, a period around 40 to 50,000 years ago when human culture underwent a stunning transformation. Cave paintings appear, sophisticated tools proliferate, jewellery and personal adornment emerge, musical instruments are created, long-distance trade networks develop. It's as if someone turned on a switch in the human brain and suddenly we became truly modern. Mainstream science explains this through a combination of cognitive developments, possibly involving mutations affecting brain structure and connectivity, combined with social and demographic changes. But the suddenness of the transformation has always puzzled researchers. Then there are the genetic anomalies. In 2001, the Human Genome Project published its initial findings, revealing that the human genome contains approximately 20 to 25,000 genes. But a subset of these genes, about 223 according to one analysis, appear to have no clear evolutionary predecessors. These genes seem to appear in the human genome without the expected intermediate forms that should exist if they evolved gradually from earlier species. The scientists involved suggested these genes might have been acquired through horizontal gene transfer from bacteria, a process that can occur in nature. Sitchin and his followers seized on this finding as potential evidence of genetic engineering. If humans were created by combining Anunnaki DNA with primitive hominid DNA, they argued, then we should expect to find genes that don't fit the normal evolutionary tree. We should find genetic material that seems to have been inserted rather than evolved. The scientific community was quick to point out that horizontal gene transfer from microorganisms is a known natural process and doesn't require alien intervention. Furthermore, as our understanding of genetics has improved, many of these apparently novel genes have been found to have evolutionary precursors that simply weren't recognized in the early genomic analysis. But the debate highlights a genuine mystery. Human beings are strange. We are the only species on this planet that has developed abstract language, mathematics, art, music, and the ability to contemplate our own existence. We are the only species that has completely transformed our environment, that has created technologies that allow us to live in every climate zone on Earth, from the Arctic to the equator. We are the only species that has left our planet and walked on another celestial body. The gap between human cognitive abilities and those of our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, is enormous, and it appeared very quickly in evolutionary terms. Is this gap evidence of genetic engineering, or is it simply the result of a particularly favourable set of mutations combined with cultural evolution? The mainstream scientific answer is clear. It's natural evolution. But the question refuses to die because the ancient texts keep whispering that there's more to the story. Let's return to those texts and examine what they say about what happened after humans were created. According to the Sumerian tablets as interpreted by Sitchin and others, the creation of Homo sapiens solved the Anunnaki labour problem. Humans were put to work in the mines and fields, serving their genetic creators. But the tablets describe a complex relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity, one characterised by both distance and surprising intimacy. The texts describe two factions among the Anunnaki leadership. Enki, the creator and chief scientist, is consistently portrayed as humanity's protector and benefactor. He is the one who warns the human king Zeusudra, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, about the coming flood. He is the one who gives humans knowledge and civilization. He is described as walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, a phrase that echoes Genesis. Enlil, on the other hand, is portrayed as stern, authoritarian, and often hostile to humanity. He sees humans as noisy, troublesome creatures who have multiplied beyond control. It is Enlil who decides to wipe out humanity with the flood. The texts describe the growing human population creating such a din that Enlil cannot sleep. This complaint about noise might seem trivial, but some researchers interpret it symbolically, the noise representing human consciousness, human culture, human independence. Enlil wanted servants, and instead humans were becoming something more. The flood narrative in the Atrahasis epic provides a fascinating contrast to the biblical account. In Genesis, God sends the flood because humanity has become wicked. It's a moral judgment. But in the Sumerian version, Enlil sends the flood simply because humans are too numerous and too noisy. There's no moral dimension to the decision. It's purely practical. The gods are annoyed, so they decide to eliminate the problem. This pragmatic, almost callous attitude toward human life is hard to reconcile with the image of benevolent deities. But it makes perfect sense if the Anunnaki were not gods but colonists, administrators of a mining operation who saw humans as a created workforce that had gotten out of hand. The story of the flood itself contains remarkable details. Enki, bound by an oath not to reveal the god's plan to any human, finds a clever loophole. He doesn't speak to Zeusudra directly. Instead, he speaks to the reed wall of Zeusudra's house, ostensibly talking to himself, knowing full well that Zeusudra is listening on the other side. This detail, the need to find a technical loophole in an oath, suggests a society governed by strict rules and regulations, or more like corporate hierarchy than a religious pantheon. Enki tells the wall to instruct its owner to tear down his house and build a boat. The specifications are precise. The boat should be sealed with bitumen, it should be roofed over, it should be stocked with the seed of all living things. Zeusudra follows these instructions. He builds the boat. He loads his family, craftsmen and animals. The flood comes, described in the text as being so violent that even the gods themselves are terrified. They flee to the highest heaven and cower like dogs. After 7 days and 7 nights the waters recede. Zeusudra opens a window and makes a sacrifice. The smell of the roasted meat wafts up to the gods who, the text explicitly states, gather around the sacrifice like flies, desperate for food. This image of gods starving without human offerings is striking. It suggests physical beings with physical needs, not transcendent spiritual entities. Enlil arrives and is furious to discover that humans have survived. But Enki argues that the plan to destroy all humans was excessive. A compromise is reached. Humanity will be allowed to survive, but new measures will be instituted to control population growth. The goddess Nintu is instructed to create certain conditions that will limit human numbers, death in childbirth, infants who die young, and women who are barren or who choose not to have children. These measures, the text suggests, are not natural consequences of biology but deliberate designs, population control mechanisms built into the human species by its creators. This is perhaps the darkest element of the Anunnaki narrative. If we take the texts literally, humans were created as a slave species, deliberately limited in lifespan, deliberately made to be dependent on their creators, deliberately restricted from achieving their full potential. The story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis echoes this theme. When humans unite to build a tower reaching to heaven, God confounds their language, forcing them to scatter across the earth. The implication is clear. United humanity is a threat, divided humanity is manageable. But alongside these disturbing elements, the texts also describe Enki's persistent efforts to help humanity. He gives humans agriculture, teaching them how to plant crops and raise animals. He gives them writing, the foundation of civilization. He gives them mathematics and astronomy. He gives them law and governance. The Sumerian king lists describe how kingship descended from heaven, how the gods established the first dynasties and taught humans how to organize society. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of a conflict among the Anunnaki. Enki wanted to elevate humanity, to see his creation reach its potential. Enlil wanted to maintain strict control, to keep humans in their subservient role. This cosmic family drama, the theory suggests, has played out throughout human history, with different factions of the Anunnaki supporting different human civilizations, sometimes openly, sometimes from the shadows. As the centuries passed, according to the texts, the Anunnaki gradually withdrew from direct interaction with humanity. They no longer walked openly among us. They no longer lived in the ziggurat temples. They became more distant, more mythological, more like the gods of religion rather than the physical overseers they had once been. By the time the Sumerian civilization collapsed around 2000 BCE, the age of direct divine rule had ended. But the knowledge they had given humanity, the cultural and technological foundations they had established, survived and spread. This is the narrative that Zecharia Sitchin constructed from his reading of the ancient texts. It's a narrative that millions have found compelling, but is it true? To answer that, we must examine the serious scholarly criticisms of Sitchin's work, because while his theories have captivated popular imagination, they have been thoroughly rejected by the academic community. And those rejections are not based on closed-minded prejudice. They are based on fundamental problems with Sitchin's methodology and conclusions. The first and most devastating criticism of Sitchin's work concerns his translations. Sitchin claimed to be able to read Sumerian and Akkadian, the languages of ancient Mesopotamia. But professional scholars who specialize in these languages, called Assyriologists and Sumerologists, have examined Sitchin's work and found it severely flawed. Dr. Michael Heiser, who holds a PhD in Hebrew and ancient Semitic languages, has been one of Sitchin's most thorough critics. Heiser points out that Sitchin's translations often have no basis in the actual meanings of words as understood by scholars. The most famous example is Sitchin's translation of Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came. Professional linguists note that Anunnaki actually means princely offspring or those of royal blood, deriving from the Sumerian words An, meaning sky or heaven, and Nuna, meaning princely. The suffix ki is a marker indicating a group. There's no implied motion from heaven to earth in the name itself. Similarly, Sitchin translated the Sumerian word Shem, which appears in ancient texts as rocket ship or sky vehicle. But every Sumerian dictionary compiled by scholars translates Shem as name or reputation. When ancient kings talked about making a Shem for themselves, they weren't talking about building spaceships. They were talking about making a name for themselves, establishing their reputation and legacy. Sitchin's claim that Nibiru is a planet beyond Pluto, inhabited by the Anunnaki, also doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The word Nibiru does appear in Babylonian astronomical texts. But scholars have extensively studied these texts using comprehensive databases of cuneiform literature. Nibiru is consistently identified as a celestial body associated with the god Marduk, and most scholars believe it refers to the planet Jupiter, not an unknown planet with a 3600-year orbit. The Babylonian astronomical texts describe Nibiru as a crossing point in the sky, particularly the point where the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator. It was a marker for navigation and calendrical purposes, not a planet. Furthermore, Sitchin's astronomical claims about Nibiru's orbit have been thoroughly debunked by planetary scientists. An object with the extreme elliptical orbit Sitchin proposed, taking 3,600 years to complete one revolution, would be gravitationally unstable. Such an orbit would be perturbed by the gravity of Jupiter, Saturn, and the other giant planets. Within a relatively small number of orbits, probably just a few dozen, the object would either be ejected from the solar system entirely or its orbit would be dramatically altered. There's simply no way for a planet-sized object to maintain a stable 3,600-year orbit in our solar system for the millions of years Sitchin's theory requires. Additionally, if such an object existed and passed through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, it would cause massive gravitational disturbances. The orbits of the known planets would show clear perturbations, orbital irregularities that could be measured and traced back to regular gravitational influences. We see no such perturbations. The orbits of the planets are exactly as they should be, given only the known objects in our solar system. Modern sky surveys have searched the outer solar system extensively using infrared telescopes that can detect faint, distant objects. These surveys have found thousands of small objects in the outer solar system, but nothing remotely approaching a planet the size Sitchin proposed. The famous Planet 9 that astronomers currently hypothesize to explain certain orbital anomalies in the Kuiper Belt is very different from Sitchin's Nibiru. It would be a distant world with an orbit of 10 to 20,000 years, never coming anywhere near Earth, nothing like the catastrophic returner that Sitchin described. Sitchin's claim about gold mining is also problematic. While the Atrahasis and other texts do describe gods performing labour and creating humans to relieve that labour, there's no textual evidence that this labour specifically involved mining gold. A search of the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, a comprehensive database of Sumerian texts, finds no references to gods mining gold. Sitchin's translation of certain divine titles as Lord of Mining has no scholarly support. It's a mistranslation or an invention designed to fit his theory. The idea that an advanced spacefaring civilization would need to come to Earth to mine gold has also been questioned on practical grounds. Gold is not particularly rare in the universe. It's created in supernova explosions and exists throughout the cosmos. An advanced civilization capable of interstellar travel would have access to asteroids and other bodies rich in metals, many of which would be far easier to mine than Earth, with its deep gravity well and its need to extract ore from beneath the surface. Why would they come specifically to Earth for gold when easier sources exist throughout the solar system? The academic consensus is clear and overwhelming. Sitchin's work is not supported by the actual textual evidence. His translations are unreliable. His astronomical claims are physically impossible. His theory requires rejecting not only mainstream linguistics and archaeology, but also physics and astronomy. Peer review, the foundation of scholarly work, has not validated any of Sitchin's major claims. Professional. Assyriologists, the people who spend their lives studying these texts and languages, uniformly reject his interpretations. This doesn't mean they're part of a conspiracy. It means that Sitchin's work, when subjected to scholarly scrutiny, doesn't hold up. But acknowledging these serious flaws doesn't completely resolve the mystery. Because while Sitchin's specific interpretations may be wrong, the texts themselves remain strange. The Sumerian creation myths are remarkably detailed. They describe a process, mixing divine essence with clay, gestation in divine wombs, the creation of worker beings. The flood narrative predates the biblical version and contains elements that seem almost clinical in their detail. The sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization with its sophisticated writing, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture remains difficult to explain through normal models of cultural evolution. And the persistent theme across ancient cultures of gods descending from the sky, living among humans and teaching them civilization keeps appearing independently in cultures that had no contact with each other. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between mainstream orthodoxy and Sitchin's radical interpretation. Alternative researchers who have built on Sitchin's work while trying to correct some of his errors propose a more nuanced theory. They suggest that the Anunnaki myths might preserve a memory of actual contact between ancient humans and a more advanced human culture, perhaps one that was destroyed in a cataclysm. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 12,800 years ago, Earth was struck by fragments from a disintegrating comet. The impacts triggered massive wildfires, rapid climate change, and mega floods from melting ice sheets. This event correlates with the extinction of megafauna, and the mysterious collapse of the Clovis culture in North America. Geologists have found evidence of this impact in the form of nanodiamonds, iridium anomalies, and spherules in sediment layers dating to precisely this period. If an advanced human civilization existed before this catastrophe, it would have been largely destroyed, with only scattered survivors carrying fragmented knowledge forward. These survivors might have appeared godlike to the Stone Age peoples they encountered. Their technological knowledge, preserved in oral tradition and gradually mythologized over thousands of years, could have become the basis for the later Sumerian accounts of gods teaching civilization to humanity. This theory doesn't require extraterrestrials. It requires only that we accept the possibility that human civilization is older and more cyclical than currently believed, that we've risen and fallen before, that the gods of ancient myth were not aliens, but our own forgotten ancestors. This revised ancient astronaut theory is more palatable to some researchers because it doesn't violate known physics and it's supported by growing geological evidence of prehistoric catastrophes, but it still faces significant obstacles. Where is the archaeological evidence of this advanced pre-Ice Age civilization? Why haven't we found their cities, their technology, or their artifacts? Proponents argue that sea level rise after the Ice Ages submerged the coastal areas where such civilizations would have thrived. They point to underwater structures like Yonaguni in Japan and the Gulf of Cambay in India as possible evidence. But mainstream archaeologists remain unconvinced. The structures appear to be natural geological formations, not artificial constructions. The debate continues, and it's important to note that healthy skepticism should cut both ways. While we should be skeptical of claims that lack solid evidence, we should also be skeptical of the assumption that current scientific understanding is complete and final. Science advances by questioning, by examining new evidence, by being willing to revise theories when data demands it. The history of science is filled with examples of maverick ideas that were initially dismissed by the establishment but were eventually proven correct. Continental drift, the existence of meteorites, the bacterial origin of stomach ulcers, all were ridiculed before being accepted. Could some version of the ancient intervention theory eventually be vindicated? It's possible, but only if solid evidence emerges. And so far, despite decades of searching, that evidence has not materialized. What we're left with is a fascinating mystery that sits at the intersection of science, history, and mythology. On one hand, we have ancient texts that describe the creation of humanity in terms that sound strikingly like genetic engineering. On the other hand, we have no physical evidence that such engineering took place. We have a scientific account of human evolution that's well supported by multiple lines of evidence, but which leaves certain questions unanswered. Why did human cognition explode so rapidly? Why is the gap between humans and other primates so vast? How did complex civilization emerge so suddenly in Mesopotamia? The answers mainstream science provides are probably correct. Natural selection combined with cultural evolution can explain human uniqueness. The agricultural revolution can explain the rise of civilization. But the tantalizing what-if remains. What if the myths are trying to tell us something true? What if our origins are stranger than we imagine? To explore this further, let's examine one more element of the Anunnaki narrative that has captured widespread attention. The connection between the ancient texts and modern UFO phenomena. Because if the Anunnaki were real, and if they left Earth thousands of years ago, some researchers ask, might they still be here observing us from a distance, or might they be planning to return? The modern UFO era began in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sighting of flying objects over Mount Rainier and the mysterious crash near Roswell, New Mexico. Since then, UFO sightings have been reported by millions of people worldwide, including commercial and military pilots, astronauts, police officers, and government officials. The US government, after decades of dismissing the phenomenon, has recently acknowledged that unidentified aerial phenomena are real and represent a genuine mystery worthy of serious scientific study. In 2020 and 2021, the Pentagon released videos taken by Navy pilots showing objects performing maneuvers that seem to defy known physics, accelerating at speeds that would destroy any conventional aircraft, making right-angle turns at high velocity and moving seamlessly from air to water. These revelations have reignited public interest in the UFO question. And for many researchers, there's a clear connection to the ancient astronaut theory. If UFOs are real and represent extraterrestrial technology, then perhaps the Anunnaki's story isn't ancient history. Perhaps it's ongoing. Some versions of the ancient astronaut theory propose that the Anunnaki never truly left Earth. Instead, they withdrew from direct public interaction, maintaining bases in remote locations, under oceans, or in underground facilities. From these hidden locations, they continue to monitor humanity, occasionally intervening in human affairs, but mostly observing their creation from a distance. The UFO phenomenon in this interpretation represents occasional glimpses of their continuing presence. The theory gains some circumstantial support from the fact that UFO reports often describe beings that are humanoid in appearance. The so-called grey aliens, small humanoid creatures with large heads and eyes, appear repeatedly in abduction accounts. Some researchers speculate these greys might be biological robots or servants created by the Anunnaki for interaction with humans. The taller Nordic-type aliens often reported, humanoids virtually indistinguishable from humans but taller and more attractive, might be the Anunnaki themselves or their descendants. The problem with this line of reasoning is that it's based entirely on anecdotal evidence. While UFO sightings and abduction reports are numerous, they provide no physical proof. The government videos of aerial phenomena show objects behaving strangely, but they don't show alien beings or prove extraterrestrial origin. The objects could be advanced human technology, natural phenomena we don't understand, or measurement errors. Without physical evidence, without specimens, without clear communication, the UFO connection to ancient astronauts remains purely speculative. There's also a more disturbing possibility that some researchers have proposed. What if the Anunnaki story is itself a deception? What if it's ancient disinformation designed to control humanity psychologically? This conspiracy theory within a conspiracy theory suggests that the myths of creator gods who will return to judge humanity are tools of social control. They create dependence, discourage independent thinking, and prepare humanity to accept authoritarian rule. When and if the Anunnaki or beings claiming to be the Anunnaki do appear, humanity will bow down, accepting their claimed authority as our creators and masters. This psychological operation, the theory goes, has been running for thousands of years, with the world's religion serving as its delivery mechanism. Whether the Anunnaki are real aliens, advanced ancient humans, or entirely fictional, the story serves the same function. It establishes a hierarchy with humanity at the bottom, forever children seeking guidance from parental figures in the sky. Some researchers go even further, suggesting that Sitchin himself might have been part of this operation. They note that despite his claims of being an outsider challenging the establishment, his books were published by major publishers and became international bestsellers, hardly the fate of genuinely suppressed information. They point to alleged connections between Sitchin and esoteric organizations, though evidence for these connections is thin. The idea essentially is that Sitchin was fed a mixture of real information and disinformation, designed to lead seekers down a specific ideological path that ultimately serves the interests of some hidden controlling group. This conspiracy theory about the conspiracy theorist is impossible to prove or disprove and veers into unfalsifiable territory where any evidence can be reinterpreted to fit the theory. But it illustrates how deep the rabbit hole goes for those who've chosen to question everything. Stepping back from these speculative labyrinths, what can we actually conclude about the Sumerian tablets and the Anunnaki? We can say with certainty that the Sumerians left behind remarkable texts describing the creation of humanity through the actions of gods who came from the sky. We can say with certainty that these texts influenced later cultures, including the Hebrew Bible. We can say with certainty that Sitchin's interpretation of these texts as describing literal extraterrestrial genetic engineering is not supported by scholarly linguistics and has been thoroughly rejected by experts in ancient Near Eastern languages. We can also say that the alternative interpretations offered by mainstream scholarship, while more sober and evidence-based, don't explain everything. The texts are strange. The sudden rise of Sumerian civilization is extraordinary. The cognitive gap between humans and other species is vast. The similarities between ancient myths across disconnected cultures are intriguing. Perhaps the truth is less dramatic but no less meaningful than either extreme position suggests. Perhaps the Sumerian texts do preserve a historical memory, not of extraterrestrials but of real human events that seemed miraculous to ancient peoples. The development of agriculture, transforming humans from hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, would have seemed like magic, like a gift from the gods. The invention of writing, allowing ideas to persist beyond a human lifetime, would have seemed like immortality granted by divine beings. The construction of the first cities, bringing thousands of people together in organised societies, would have required leadership that seemed superhuman in its wisdom and capability. The gods of ancient mythology might represent real historical figures, leaders and innovators whose achievements were so extraordinary that they were deified by their grateful descendants. Over generations and centuries their stories would grow, their deeds embellished, until they became the myths we read today. Or perhaps the truth is even more mysterious than we can currently imagine. Perhaps there are aspects of human origins and human consciousness that science has not yet discovered. Perhaps there are chapters of our history that have been lost, not through conspiracy but through the simple passage of time and the fragility of evidence. Perhaps the universe is stranger and more populated than our current observations suggest, and contact between species occurs in ways we haven't recognised. What the Anunnaki story ultimately represents is humanity's deep and persistent intuition that we are more than we appear to be, that our origins are mysterious, that we have a destiny beyond mere survival and reproduction. Whether the Anunnaki were aliens, advanced ancient humans, or mythological projections of our hopes and fears, the story speaks to something profound in the human psyche. The desire to know where we came from, the hope that we're part of something larger than ourselves, the fear that we're alone, but also the fear that we're not. The clay tablets of Sumer sit in museums around the world. They've been catalogued, translated, studied, and debated for over a century. They're not going to suddenly reveal a clear smoking gun proving extraterrestrial intervention. But they're also not going to stop asking questions of anyone who reads them with an open mind. What were the Sumerians really describing? Why did they believe their gods were so physically present? Why do their creation myths sound so technical? Why did civilization emerge so suddenly in their land? These questions remain, and they're worth asking, even if the answers we seek continue to elude us. The story of the Anunnaki, whether historical or mythological, serves as a mirror. It reflects our own uncertainties about who we are and what we're capable of becoming. It challenges us to question our assumptions about the past and about the potential that may lie dormant within our species. Perhaps we are the product of natural evolution alone, the result of billions of years of random mutation and natural selection. Perhaps we are the greatest achievement of chance. Or perhaps somewhere in our genetic code, in the mysterious junk DNA that makes up most of our genome, there's a signature we haven't learned to read yet. A message from whoever or whatever sparked the change that made us human. The search for our origins continues, not in crumbling tablets alone, but in laboratories where scientists map every gene, and in telescopes that scan the cosmos for signs of life beyond Earth. Each discovery adds to our understanding, but also reveals how much we still don't know. The Anunnaki theory, for all its flaws and unsupported claims, has done something valuable. It has kept alive the questions. It has reminded us that certainty is the enemy of discovery. It has encouraged millions to look at ancient history with fresh eyes and to consider possibilities that mainstream science might dismiss too quickly. Whether you believe the Sumerian tablets describe genetic engineering by extraterrestrials, or simply preserve humanity's first written myths, one thing is undeniable. Those tablets tell a story about us, about our origins, our nature, our purpose. They tell of beings who laboured, who rebelled, who created and destroyed, who struggled with questions of justice and authority, and the proper relationship between the powerful and the powerless. In other words, they tell very human stories. And perhaps that's the deepest truth. Whatever the Anunnaki were or weren't, the stories we tell about them are stories we tell about ourselves, about where we think we came from, about what we fear we might be, and about what we hope we can become. The mystery remains open. The tablets wait scantily in their climate-controlled cases. The stars continue their slow wheel overhead, as they did when the first Sumerian scribe pressed a stylus into soft clay and began to write the oldest stories our species has ever told. Stories of the gods who came from the sky, stories of humanity's beginning, stories that we're still trying to understand 6,000 years later. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Because the day we stop asking where we came from is the day we stop wondering where we're going. And for a species that has reached for the stars from the moment we first learned to stand upright, that would be the greatest tragedy of all. The truth about the Anunnaki, whatever it may be, is still being written. Written in the discoveries of archaeologists sifting through ancient ruins, written in the data returned by space probes and planet-hunting telescopes, written in the genetic code that every human carries, written in the persistent human drive to explore, to question, to refuse to accept the easy answers. The Sumerian tablets revealed something 6,000 years ago. Not necessarily the truth about genetic engineering by aliens, but certainly a truth about us, that we are a species who needs to know, who builds great towers to reach the heavens, who writes our questions in stone and clay so they will outlast our brief lives, who looks at the stars and asks, are we alone? Whether the answer comes from ancient texts or future discoveries, the question itself is what makes us human. And that, perhaps, is the real revelation the tablets have to offer. But before we close this investigation, there are specific details in the Sumerian text that deserve closer examination. Details that even mainstream scholars find puzzling, and which continue to fuel speculation about hidden knowledge in these ancient records. Let us return one final time to the clay tablets themselves and examine what they actually say about human creation, stripping away both the uncritical acceptance of ancient astronaut theorists and the dismissive certainty of conventional academics. What remains when we look at the evidence with fresh, unbiased eyes? The text known as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic dating to approximately 1100 BCE, but preserving much older Sumerian traditions, describes the creation of the cosmos and humanity in elaborate detail. After the god Marduk defeats the chaos dragon Tiamat and creates the heavens and earth from her corpse, he proposes the creation of humans. The text states, "I will create a savage. Man shall be his name. He will be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease." The word used for this savage or primitive being is Lulu, which scholars translate as primitive man or mankind. But the process described for creating this Lulu is remarkably specific. The god Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, describes the method. They will slay one god, and from his blood they will fashion mankind. The service of the gods will be established, and they will set up shrines. The gods hold a council to determine which god should be sacrificed for this purpose. They choose Kingu, who had led Tiamat's forces in the cosmic war. He is executed, and from his blood mixed with clay, humanity is formed. The text emphasizes that this sacrifice imparts something specific to humanity. The god had intelligence. The sacrifice of the god is not random. They specifically choose one who possessed intelligence, suggesting that what they're transferring to humanity through his blood is cognitive capability. This theme of divine blood or essence being mixed with earthly clay to create humans appears across multiple Mesopotamian creation accounts. In the Atrahasis epic, the most detailed version, the process is even more explicit. The goddess Mami, another name for Nintu, declares, "Let him be formed out of clay animated with blood." The text describes her taking the clay, having the Igigi god spit upon it, and then mixing it with the blood and flesh of the slain god Wi'ila. She then divides this mixture into 14 portions, places 7 on the right for males and 7 on the left for females. Most remarkably, the text states that these portions are then implanted into the wombs of birth goddesses, who gestate them for 10 months before giving birth to the first humans. Modern readers familiar with in vitro fertilization and surrogacy can't help but notice the parallels. The description sounds like a primitive culture's attempt to describe assisted reproduction and genetic engineering using the only vocabulary and conceptual framework available to them. Clay mixed with blood could be understood as biological material combined with genetic information. Gestation in divine wombs could describe artificial wombs or surrogacy. The 10-month period matches human gestation. The division into male and female portions suggests chromosome selection or genetic sex determination. Are these parallels meaningful, or are we imposing modern concepts onto ancient religious metaphors? The mainstream scholarly interpretation is clear. These texts are religious mythology explaining the relationship between gods and humans. The mixing of divine blood with clay is a theological statement about human nature. We are both earthly and divine, mortal and spiritual. The message is about purpose and relationship. Humans exist to serve the gods, relieving them of labour. The stories use physical, concrete imagery because that's how ancient peoples thought and communicated. The gods aren't literally mixing blood and clay, they're performing divine acts that transcend physical processes. But some details in the texts resist easy categorization as pure metaphor. The Sumerian text known as the debate between cattle and grain describes a time before humans, existed when the gods themselves had to work. The gods in their assembly were unsure. The Anuna, the great gods, did not know bread for eating, did not know cloth for wearing. They ate plants with their mouths like sheep, drank water from the ditch. This description of gods eating grass and drinking from ditches before humans were created to serve them is strangely specific and undignified. Why would a culture create religious texts showing their gods in such a primitive, undignified state? Unless they were preserving an actual memory of a transitional period, a time before organised agriculture and civilization, remembered in the cultural tradition as the time before humans served the gods. The Sumerian king list presents another puzzle that mainstream scholarship struggles to fully explain. This ancient document, existing in multiple copies, lists the rulers of Sumerian cities from the mythical past through historical times. What makes it extraordinary is that it divides history into two distinct eras, before the flood and after the flood. The kings who ruled before the flood are credited with impossibly long reigns. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. The second, Alalnga, ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings in total ruled for a combined 241,200 years before the Great Flood swept over the land. Then after the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, but the reign lengths become progressively shorter. The first post-flood kings ruled for 200 or 1,000 years. By the time we reach kings who can be verified through other historical sources, the reign lengths have become humanly plausible, ranging from 20 to 50 years. Mainstream scholars interpret the pre-Diluvian kings as purely mythological. Their enormous reign lengths meant to convey the antiquity and divine sanction of the institution of kingship. The transition to shorter reigns reflects the list's gradual movement from myth to history. But the specific numbers are puzzling. Why 28,800 years? Why 36,000? These aren't random large numbers. They're multiples of 3,600. If you divide each pre-Diluvian reign length by 3,600, you get much more reasonable numbers. 10 periods of 300 years. 8 periods, 6 periods. Sitchin seized on this observation, noting that 300 was the orbital period he attributed to Nibiru. He argued the list was recording the reigns of Anunnaki rulers whose lifespans were measured not in Earth years, but in Nibiruan years. While this interpretation requires accepting Sitchin's unsupported premise about Nibiru's existence and orbit, the mathematical pattern itself is real and unexplained. Why structure mythological reign lengths as multiples of 3,600? One possibility is that 300 was a significant number in Sumerian mathematics and cosmology, representing a completed cosmic cycle. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal numerical system, counting in base 60. 3,600 is 60 squared, making it a perfect number in their mathematical framework. The reign lengths might be symbolic, representing cosmic rather than terrestrial timescales. But this still doesn't fully explain why the post-flood reign lengths gradually decrease in a way that suggests a transition from one type of being to another, from gods or god-human hybrids to fully mortal humans. The flood itself is another element that appears across so many ancient cultures that it demands explanation. While the Sumerian, Babylonian and biblical flood accounts are clearly related through cultural transmission, flood myths appear in cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia. Native American tribes, Australian Aboriginals, Pacific Islanders, South American civilizations, and Chinese traditions all contain accounts of a great deluge that destroyed an earlier world. The global distribution of these flood myths has led some researchers to propose that they preserve a common memory of actual catastrophic flooding at the end of the last ice age, between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. As ice sheets melted and sea levels rose by over 400 feet, coastal areas around the world were inundated. Human populations that had settled in these areas would have been displaced or destroyed. The catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea around 600 BCE, when the Mediterranean breached the Bosporus and flooded what had been a freshwater lake, may have contributed to Mesopotamian flood traditions. The Lake Agassiz flood around 8,400 years ago, when a glacial lake larger than all current Great Lakes combined suddenly drained, would have caused massive downstream flooding. These were real historical catastrophes that would have seemed like the end of the world to those who experienced them. Oral traditions preserved these memories, and eventually they were written down in texts like the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. But there's another layer to the flood narrative that's particularly relevant to the genetic engineering theory. In both the Sumerian and biblical accounts, the flood is not just a natural disaster. It's a deliberate act by the gods or God to destroy humanity. And importantly, it fails to achieve its goal because one god, Enki or Ea, warns a favoured human and helps him survive. The survival of Ziusudra or Utnapishtim or Noah preserves not just human lives but the divine intention behind human creation. Humanity was meant to serve, and despite the attempt to wipe them out, that purpose is preserved. After the flood, in the Atrahasis account, new population control measures are instituted. Infant mortality, barren women, celibate priestesses. These are described not as natural phenomena, but as deliberate creations by the gods to prevent human overpopulation from again becoming a problem. This framing of what we consider natural biological and social phenomena as deliberate divine designs is disturbing if taken literally. It suggests that aspects of the human condition we view as unfortunate but inevitable, infant death, infertility, are actually engineered features of our species. The ancient astronaut interpretation takes this literally, arguing that the Anunnaki genetically programmed limits into humanity, ensuring we would remain controllable and dependent. A less literal but still meaningful interpretation sees these texts as ancient, attempts to explain suffering and mortality through theological frameworks. Why do babies die? Because the gods decreed it after the flood. Why can't all women have children? Because the goddess Nintu established it as a control mechanism. These narratives serve the psychological function of making senseless tragedy comprehensible by attributing it to divine purpose. The ziggurat temples that dominated Sumerian cities provide another intriguing piece of the puzzle. These massive step pyramids were far more than religious structures. They were the administrative, economic, and political centres of their cities. The temple complex included granaries, workshops, libraries, and the residences of priests and administrators. At the very top of each ziggurat was a small shrine, the dwelling place of the city's patron god. But here's what's fascinating. Archaeological evidence shows these shrines were regularly supplied with food, drink, and fresh bedding. The priests performed daily rituals of caring for the god as if the god were physically present and required these provisions. This could be dismissed as primitive religious practice, but consider it from another angle. If the Anunnaki were physical beings who periodically visited or resided in these temples, then what we call religious ritual might have been actual hospitality and service to resident administrators. The food offerings weren't symbolic, they were meals. The cleansing rituals weren't magic, they were housekeeping. The hymns and prayers weren't mystical communion, they were communication and reporting to superiors. When the tablets describe gods smelling the sweet savour of sacrifices and gathering like flies to partake in offerings, as they do in the flood story, this could be religious anthropomorphism, or it could be a memory of actual beings who consumed the food provided to them. The question of where the Anunnaki went, if they existed, is central to evaluating the entire theory. The tablets themselves provide hints. References to the Anunnaki become less frequent and less concrete over time. By the first millennium BCE, when Babylon was at its height, the Anunnaki are more mythological than the earlier Sumerian texts portrayed them. They've become part of the cosmic furniture, the great gods who established order at the beginning of time, but no longer active participants in daily events. This transition from present gods to absent gods mirrors the development of religion in many cultures. As societies become more sophisticated, their gods become more abstract, more transcendent, less physically involved in the world. The ancient astronaut explanation is that the Anunnaki completed their mission, extracted sufficient gold or whatever resources they required, and left Earth to return to their homeworld. They left behind the civilizations they had established, trusting that humans would maintain themselves and continue to develop. Periodic returns might explain later cultural, flowering in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and other regions where advanced civilizations seem to emerge with suspicious sophistication. But this requires accepting not just that the Anunnaki existed, but that they had the capability for interstellar travel and the patience for missions spanning hundreds of thousands of years. An alternative possibility proposed by some researchers is that the Anunnaki were not extraterrestrials, but terrestrials from an earlier cycle of civilization. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, supported by a growing body of geological evidence, proposes that a comet impact around 12,800 years ago triggered a return to Ice Age conditions lasting over a millennium. This impact would have devastated any advanced civilization existing at that time. If an advanced human culture, perhaps with technology comparable to our own 19th or early 20th century, was destroyed in this cataclysm, survivors might have been forced to integrate with Stone Age populations. Their knowledge and achievements, fading through oral tradition over generations, could have become the basis for myths of gods who once walked among humans, teaching civilization before departing or dying out. This lost civilization hypothesis has the advantage of not requiring extraterrestrial visitors, which violate no known laws of physics and require no elaborate conspiracy theories about hidden planets. It only requires accepting that human civilization might be older than currently believed, and that major catastrophes have reset our cultural development. The main evidence for this theory comes from geological markers of the Younger Dryas impact, from anomalous archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a sophisticated temple complex dated to 11 suns even 600 years ago built by supposed hunter-gatherers, and from the widespread presence of flood myths and fallen Golden Age narratives in ancient cultures worldwide. However, this theory faces its own significant obstacles. If an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization existed, where are its remains? Why haven't we found extensive ruins, technology, or clear archaeological evidence? Proponents argue that coastal submergence after Ice Age sea level rise has hidden such evidence underwater, and that millennia of geological activity have erased or buried most traces, but archaeology has found evidence of much less advanced cultures from much earlier periods. Stone tools from millions of years ago survive. Why wouldn't at least some remains of a recent advanced civilization? The truth is, we don't have definitive answers. What we have are ancient texts that describe events we cannot fully verify, a fossil and genetic record that shows human evolution but leaves certain questions open, archaeological evidence of sudden civilizational advancement, and a persistent cross-cultural tradition of gods or advanced beings teaching humanity. Each piece of evidence can be interpreted multiple ways depending on one's starting assumptions. If you begin with the assumption that extraterrestrial visitation is impossible, you'll interpret the evidence one way. If you begin with the assumption that ancient peoples must have been recording actual events, you'll interpret it differently. The challenge is to examine the evidence as objectively as possible, acknowledging both the explanatory strengths and weaknesses of each interpretation. What the Sumerian tablets undeniably show us is that the world's first civilization had a sophisticated understanding of their own origins, even if that understanding was expressed through mythological and religious frameworks. They believed they were created to serve the gods. They believed civilization was a gift from divine teachers. They believed in a time before cities and agriculture, when both gods and humans lived more primitively. And they recorded all of this in permanent form, pressing their words into clay tablets that would survive for thousands of years, outlasting their entire civilization. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the Anunnaki were real in the way ancient astronaut theorists propose, but why humans across every culture and time period have felt compelled to create such stories. Why do we need origin myths? Why do we imagine beings greater than ourselves who gave us life and purpose? Is it simply a psychological need? A way of dealing with the existential terror of consciousness and mortality? Or is it something else? A fragmented racial memory of actual events, filtered through thousands of years of cultural evolution until the historical core is buried beneath layers of metaphor and theological interpretation? The Sumerian tablets cannot give us a final answer, but they can give us the oldest written version of questions that humans are still asking today. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? And if we're not alone, what is our relationship to those who came before or exist beyond? These questions drive our scientific exploration of the cosmos, our searches for habitable worlds and extraterrestrial intelligence, our efforts to decode the human genome and understand consciousness. Whether we frame them in religious or scientific terms, they remain fundamentally the same questions the Sumerians asked when they looked at the stars and wondered about the Anunnaki. The clay tablets wait in museums and archives, their cuneiform symbols precisely rendered, their messages preserved across millennia. They tell us that 6,000 years ago, humans were asking the same questions we ask today. They tell us that the search for answers about our origins and our place in the universe is not new. It's one of the oldest human endeavours, and they remind us that certainty is elusive. The past keeps its secrets. We can study it, interpret it, build theories about it, but we cannot fully know it. The Anunnaki, whether they were gods, aliens, advanced humans, or metaphors, have left us with a legacy of mystery. And perhaps mystery is itself the gift, because the pursuit of answers, the refusal to accept that some questions are beyond investigation, the determination to keep searching for truth even when the evidence is incomplete, These are the qualities that define us as a species. The Sumerian tablets documented human civilization at its beginning. They recorded our first laws, our first epic poetry, our first astronomical observations, our first attempts to understand who and what we are. They established a tradition of inquiry and documentation that continues to this day. Whether the specific story they tell about human origins is literal truth, cultural metaphor, or something in between, their deeper message is clear. We are a species that asks questions, that seeks answers, that refuses to accept mysteries as permanently unsolvable. The search for the truth about the Anunnaki continues. In excavations of ancient sites, in laboratories analysing ancient DNA, in telescopes scanning distant stars for signs of life, in the work of linguists deciphering ancient texts, and in the imaginations of millions who look at those ancient tablets and wonder, what if? The final verdict on whether the Anunnaki were real visitors to ancient Earth or mythological constructs of the human imagination may never come. But the questions they inspire, the curiosity they generate, the debates they fuel, these are real and valuable. Because in asking where we came from, we're really asking who we are. And in seeking to understand our origins, we're trying to understand our destiny. The Sumerian tablets gave us the first written version of these questions, and 6,000 years later, we're still seeking the answers. There is one final aspect of this mystery that demands our attention. The question of why this particular theory, the idea that humans were genetically engineered by the Anunnaki, has captured imagination so powerfully in our modern age. The ancient astronaut theory didn't emerge in the 1970s, with Sitchin's books appearing in a vacuum. It emerged at a specific moment in history, during a time when humanity was experiencing profound technological and cultural changes. Understanding this context helps us understand not just the theory itself, but what it reveals about us, about our hopes and fears in the modern world. The 1960s and 1970s saw humanity accomplish something that had been dreamed of for millennia but never achieved. We left our planet. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon, and suddenly, ancient fantasies of celestial travel became concrete reality. If humans could journey to other worlds, then the reverse must also be possible. If we could become visitors to alien landscapes, then perhaps Earth had once been visited as well. The space age made ancient astronaut theories suddenly plausible in a way they never had been before. The logic was simple. We're doing it now, so someone more advanced than us could have done it in our past. This was also the era of the UFO phenomenon reaching its cultural peak. Sightings were being reported worldwide. The US government was investigating through Project Blue Book. Books like Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods were becoming international bestsellers. The cultural zeitgeist was primed for a theory that connected ancient mysteries with extraterrestrial visitation. Sitchin's contribution was to provide a specific, detailed framework based on actual ancient texts rather than vague speculation. He gave the ancient astronaut theory academic veneer, linguistic expertise, and a coherent narrative spanning hundreds of thousands of years. But there was something deeper happening as well. The 1970s were a time of widespread distrust in institutions. The Vietnam War had shattered faith in government. Watergate had revealed corruption at the highest levels. Religious institutions were being questioned as never before. Scientific authority was being challenged by countercultural movements. In this environment, alternative histories that positioned mainstream academia as either ignorant or actively suppressing truth found fertile ground. Sitchin's theories offered an explanation for why civilization seemed so mysterious. It wasn't that archaeologists and historians were correctly piecing together the evidence. They were missing, or hiding, the most important part of the story, the extraterrestrial intervention. This narrative empowered readers who felt marginalized by academic institutions. You don't need credentials or degrees to understand the truth, the theory implied. You just need to read the texts with fresh eyes, without the blinders of establishment dogma. There's also a theological dimension to the ancient astronaut theory's appeal. For many people raised in religious traditions but unable to accept supernatural explanations in a scientific age, the Anunnaki theory offered a middle path. It preserved the narrative structure of creation myths. Powerful beings created humans for a purpose. But it replaced gods with aliens, the supernatural with the technological. It was religion for the space age, maintaining the emotional and narrative satisfaction of religious faith while appearing to be based on scientific evidence and historical texts, rather than mere faith. This made it particularly appealing to people experiencing cognitive dissonance, between their religious upbringing and their modern scientific understanding. The theory also spoke to questions about human purpose and meaning that neither traditional religion nor secular materialism seemed to answer satisfactorily. If humans are just random products of evolution, then we have no inherent purpose. If we're created by a traditional god, then that purpose is defined by ancient religious texts that many find difficult to accept literally. But if we're engineered by advanced aliens, then we have purpose. We were created for a reason, but that purpose is potentially negotiable, potentially something we can evolve beyond. We're not cosmic accidents, but we're also not bound to serve invisible deities forever. We're a created species that might someday equal or surpass our creators. This narrative of humanity as a species with engineered origins but unlimited potential resonates powerfully in an age of rapid technological advancement. We're now doing things that would have seemed like magic to our ancestors. We're mapping our own genome, editing genes, creating artificial intelligence, building machines that can think. We're becoming, in a sense, gods ourselves, creators capable of designing life. The Anunnaki theory suggests that this was always our trajectory, that we're following in the footsteps of those who created us, that becoming masters of genetic engineering and space travel isn't hubristic, but is fulfilling our designed purpose. It transforms technological advancement from something potentially frightening into our destiny and birthright. Critics of the ancient astronaut theory argue that this psychological appeal is precisely why we should be skeptical of it. Theories that feel good, that resolve our existential anxieties and give us a sense of cosmic significance, should be held to even higher standards of evidence precisely because we want them to be true. The burden of proof for extraordinary claims must be extraordinarily high. We must guard against confirmation bias, against seeing what we want to see in ancient texts and archaeological evidence. The scientific method exists specifically to counteract these human tendencies toward wishful thinking. It demands reproducible evidence, peer review, falsifiable hypotheses. When a theory is embraced by millions but rejected by experts in the relevant fields, that's a warning sign that psychology rather than evidence is driving belief. Yet this criticism, while valid, doesn't completely dismiss the value of alternative theories and questioning of established narratives. Science has progressed precisely because some researchers were willing to question prevailing theories and look at evidence in new ways. Plate tectonics was once considered pseudoscience. The bacterial origin of ulcers was ridiculed before being proven true. Quantum mechanics seemed impossible until experiments forced physicists to accept it. While most alternative theories turn out to be wrong, some represent genuine advances in understanding. The challenge is distinguishing legitimate scientific challenges from unfounded speculation. The ancient astronaut theory has now existed for decades. It has had ample time to produce the physical evidence that would validate it. Archaeological excavations continue worldwide. Genetic sequencing becomes more sophisticated every year. Space telescopes scan the cosmos. If the theory were true, we should by now have found something. An artifact that can't be explained by known human cultures. A genetic marker that clearly shows artificial manipulation. Evidence of Nibiru in astronomical observations. We haven't found these things. This doesn't prove the theory is false. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But it does suggest that if extraterrestrial intervention in human origins occurred, it was either so long ago or so carefully hidden that it's left no detectable trace. And at that point the theory becomes unfalsifiable, which moves it from the realm of science into the realm of faith. You can choose to believe it, but you cannot prove it. And perhaps more importantly, it can never be disproven. Any absence of evidence can be explained away as evidence successfully hidden or not yet discovered. This is the fundamental problem with many conspiracy theories. They are constructed in a way that makes them immune to disproof, and therefore immune to the normal processes of scientific investigation. Where does this leave us? We have ancient texts that describe human creation through divine intervention. We have a scientific understanding of evolution that explains human origins through natural processes. We have a modern interpretation that attempts to reconcile these by reading the text as descriptions of alien genetic engineering. And we have no conclusive physical evidence that clearly validates any single interpretation over the others. Each person must decide for themselves which explanation they find most credible, most meaningful, most aligned with their understanding of the world. Some will find the scientific consensus compelling, trusting the expertise of researchers who have devoted their lives to understanding human evolution ancient languages, and the history of civilization. Others will find alternative explanations more satisfying, whether because they distrust institutional science, because they find the coincidences and mysteries too compelling to dismiss, or because the narrative resonates with their intuitive sense of truth. What we can all agree on, regardless of our conclusions, is that the questions matter. Understanding where we came from, whether through evolution or creation or some combination of both, is fundamental to understanding who we are and what we might become. The Sumerian tablets, regardless of whether their accounts are literal, metaphorical, or something in between, represent humanity's first systematic attempt to answer these questions through written record. They established a tradition of inquiry, of trying to understand origins through investigation rather than simply accepting mystery. This tradition continues in modern science, in archaeology, in genetics, in astronomy. The methods have become more sophisticated, the evidence more concrete, but the fundamental questions remain the same. Perhaps the greatest legacy of both the Sumerian tablets and the modern theories they've inspired is that they remind us to keep questioning, to keep investigating, to never assume we have all the answers. Human knowledge is always incomplete. Our understanding of the past is always limited by the evidence that has survived and our ability to interpret it. What seems impossible today might be proven tomorrow. What seems certain today might be overturned by new discoveries. This is not a weakness but a strength. It's what allows knowledge to progress, understanding to deepen, and mysteries to potentially be solved. The story of the Anunnaki, whatever its ultimate truth, has value in keeping these questions alive. It encourages people to look at ancient texts as potentially containing historical information rather than dismissing them as mere mythology. It pushes researchers to explain the genuine mysteries in human prehistory rather than simply asserting that evolution explains everything. It keeps alive a sense of wonder about our origins and our place in a potentially inhabited cosmos. 6,000 years ago, Sumerian scribes pressed reed styluses into soft clay, creating wedge-shaped symbols that told the story of humanity's beginning. Those clay tablets have survived floods, wars, the rise and fall of empires, the death of their language, and the forgetting of their creators. They've outlasted everything except the questions they raise. Questions about where we came from, about whether we're alone, about whether our origins are purely natural or involved some kind of intervention or design. These questions remain unanswered, but they remain alive, kept alive by ancient texts and modern theories, by believers and skeptics, by scientists and seekers. And as long as they remain alive, as long as we keep asking and investigating and refusing to accept easy answers, then we honour the deepest truth that those ancient scribes recorded, that we are a species defined by our questions, driven by our curiosity, and elevated by our refusal to accept that any mystery is beyond our capacity to eventually understand. The truth about the Anunnaki may forever remain beyond our grasp, but the search for that truth, and what that search reveals about us, is a story still being written in laboratories and excavation sites and observatories around the world. And that story, the story of humanity seeking to understand itself, may be the most important story of all.